Hi and welcome to the show. I'm your host Patrick Shearer and you're watching In the Studio. The show is brought to you by Davis Media Access and goes out over Davis Community Television. That's Comcast Channel 15 and AT&T Uverse. We're also available online at davismedia.org, so log on and check us out. My guest today is Roberto Delgadillo from the UCD Shields Library and the winner of the 2012 I Love My Librarian Award. Roberto, thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and congratulations first of all.
Oh, thank you.
Now, tell us a bit about the award. You know, who nominated you and why?
Sure. The award itself was established a little over 8 years ago as a joint venture through the Carnegie Foundation, the American Library Association, and the New York Times.
Ah.
Its purpose was to recognize public, special, and academic librarians who have gone out of the way to help their user populations.
Right.
And in my case, I was nominated by Professor Miroslava Chavez Garcia, with whom I work with in the context as a subject bibliographer with the Department of Chicano Studies at UC
cool.
Davis. In addition to her, I was also nominated with supporting documentation by Professor Gloria Rodriguez of the School of Education.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, tell us why you were nominated. I mean, I've had to read through the nomination. There's lots of reasons there. That
Sure.
the one that jumped out at me first was the hands-on support you provide
Sure.
to all the students.
I mean, that stems primarily from the feeling that I have of wanting to give back to the University of California. Often when I give BI, or rather bibliographic instruction sessions at the library, I often remind students that I've been a part of the University of California since the age of 18. I'm currently 45.
Okay.
So I like to think that I know exactly what they're going through.
Yep.
In terms of, put them at ease, if you will, because one of the things that a lot of incoming graduate students, or I mean rather undergrads and graduate students alike, is that they have a pretty good idea as to what to expect, but when you're facing time constraints, you see that those slip. So that very often, for instance, you're told in theory that you have 10 weeks.
Yeah.
The reality with finals, you can whittle that down to 8.
Yeah. Throw in other assignments.
Yeah, and then like when they're, given that they're having to work with assignments every other week, along with life, work, procrastination.
Yes.
It goes down to basically about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And so my job is to try to help them transition and make maximum use of that, and help it find as fast as they can.
Yeah.
Also, quite frankly, they're paying me. I'm their resource. And it's astounding to me at times how, even now, and I've been at Davis now a little over 8 years, it's astounding to me how many people do not, in fact, take advantage of the library.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, this is the first time I've really used it, and been here close to 3 to 4 years, and this is great, or what have you. And it's, well, it's your resource. You're paying for it. You'll thank me as you're paying back your parents are paying back your loans, or you're paying your loans. So try to take advantage of it. So I think that's what I think in terms of giving back for the students. I just think about my experiences when I was an undergraduate and what I didn't take advantage of, and so I trying to put in their shoes of wanting them to take advantage of what they are missing out on.
Because it's not just going and checking out a book or finding something.
No,
information management's a real art.
Sure, information management and just the whole research process as well too.
Yeah.
And for a lot of these students, I think, it's a sort of thing where, unfortunately, this is where the legacy of the closure of school libraries at the elementary and secondary level has come into play.
Yeah.
A lot of students, and to some extent, this even extends to graduate students as well too. They have lost the teaching, if you will, of the research process, and it is just far more than having to consult a print source or electronic source. And even with both, there are just different ways of, or you have to employ rather different techniques of finding this information. And the wide range of disciplines that I cover in the humanities and social sciences, I think one of the fun parts that I get is having to think of different ways of how to approach the particular topic, and kind of keeping in mind what they're also presenting me as well too. So, and figuring that out requires a conversation.
So, how did you come to be a librarian?
I'm very much what you would call an accidental librarian.
Okay.
As a small child in Nicaragua, I had wanted to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And through circumstance, I came to the United States. And as a result, I wanted to pursue wanting to be a teacher. And I had this dream pretty much until I got to high school, where an influential mentor of mine said to me, well, Roberto, no offense, we have plenty of Latino teachers. What we don't have are Latino professors. Oh. And by that time I had had a strong interest in history. Yeah. So that when I subsequently went to UC Santa Cruz for my undergraduate degree there, I thought, okay, maybe I'll want to pursue what it would take to be a history professor. Fast forward to my third year in college, I took this pre-graduate school seminar, course, if you will, to kind of prepare you for what to expect in graduate school. Yeah. And let's just say that I was kind of left a little bit terrified. I recall on the first day, I was in the company of a number of other students who were going through that process, and the person walking us through the process basically laid out some pretty grim statistics. Yeah. And at the end of that, I realized I better have a backup. I kept having these fantasies of mine driving a taxi for some reason and telling someone, oh, I couldn't cut it as a history professor, and so this is what I left with. And luckily, I had a very close friend who basically said to me, well, you currently work in a library. At the time, I was a student worker. She says, well, you work in a library. You want to be a history professor, so that involves research. Yep. She said to me, and you just laid out that this program that you want to pursue in history is going to be between 6 to 8 years, is what on average is what it takes. Yeah. And she says, well, for a man willing to do 6 to 8 years, why ask the librarian for help when you can be the librarian? If it doesn't work out, you can have that as a fallback. So I figured, okay, why not? So I then prepared myself to do that, and then went to school at UCLA, library school program, although truth be told, I wanted to say Northern California, but when I applied, and this was back in '93, the UC Berkeley Library Science program was closed. They transformed it into an information studies program, which may sound similar, but it's really not. And at that time, it was very, very different. Yeah. And in '92, '93, there was this feeling that, oh, the internet's coming on, you don't need librarians.
Yep. Everything's going to go digital.
Everything's going digital.
We've been hearing that for the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, and so a lot of us were given a choice who got accepted into that program. Go back to Southern California, or stay at in my case specifically, stay at Cal State San Jose. Yeah. Given that I'd gone to UC Santa Cruz, I kind of felt a little snobbish about it. No, I don't want to go to Cal State San Jose, so I went back and stayed there, and so that's where I ended up at UCLA. Yeah. And after I finished that, worked in a public library for the next 5 years, and by this time I met my future ex-wife, but at the time her family and her were very generous enough to support me to want to pursue this dream of getting a PhD in history. Yeah. And so that when I finally did do it, I found that it wasn't to my liking, if you will. Now, mind you, when I went through library school, it was a very different mindset. So, for example, if you needed help with with an assignment, explicitly and implicitly, you're shown, oh, well, let me help you find that information. Yeah. Let me help you find it. Whereas,
well, no. But I was just going to point out a couple of things that you've said. It's really interesting that you made the differentiation between teacher and professor, and also that that you said there was a real difference between taking on a PhD and taking on the a library studies course. Sure. Because the PhD and the library studies course, they're both about information management, but the way you go about it is very different.
Well, my case was different, actually. Yeah. Mine was a bit, the library science degree, it's a professional degree. You can apply it to any discipline you want. Yeah. A PhD is an academic one. You have to be really specific. And mine was not library science. Mine was, before it changed a number of different times. I put it this way: I started with wanting to look into German-Soviet military history. That's what I prepared myself for when I got to UC Santa Cruz. One of the things about UC Santa Cruz is that you can create your own major. Yep. So I recall getting there right off the bat, wanting to take German and Russian, and not worry about my lower division classes. So I was that rare student who was a senior. I was taking intro to writing or introduction to American popular music, stuff like that. All the upper division stuff I had taken care of. And I remember the advisor I had, who was well-meaningly trying to tell me, oh, but you want to take your first 2 years, you want to explore the different disciplines. I said, no, I already know what I want. Thank you very much. I had as I said, this high school mentor had geared me towards wanting to be a history teacher, now professor. Yeah. But when I was done with it, and library school, I should also mention as well too, 1 year, right up there. And in the library profession, there's this joke that when on the first day when you begin library school, everyone kind of talks about why they want to become a librarian. And it's the usual, oh, I want to become a librarian because I love the smell of old books, or I used to work in a bookstore, or my mom was a children's librarian. And when they come up to me, of course, I had this, Buckley-esque, well, I do not plan to do that. I plan to be a professor of history. You people with your little hair bonds are fascinating, but point is, 1 year right out the other, didn't care. And so then, long story short, when I finally did go through and get into the PhD program, I found it wasn't to my liking, in the sense that a lot of it was theory-driven. And theory-driven is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But when I found myself as a TA trying to explain a lot of this stuff that I could at times barely understand, and trying to give it to a graduate student, or an undergrad rather, it didn't seem fair, if you will. It wasn't there. And of course, I was reminded more than once by my advisor and others that in a PhD, you're not there to teach; you're there to do research. And so for me, I kind of felt like, it only strengthened my attitude of wanting to give back and become a librarian. So by the time I got done, I realized, well, maybe this isn't what I want to do. And so I decided then, I said, I'm not going to pursue this for what I wanted. And the other thing too is, and this is kind of interesting, is by way of evolution, I also found as a TA, I was a terrible TA. Terrible in the sense that I would freeze up. I would mutter, I would stutter, and I tried all the usual techniques of, pretend people are naked, pretend they're, no, couldn't do that. It wouldn't work. The only way it could work for me is if I gave something in the context of a comedy skit. But that didn't work, because after a while I asked myself, well, is my students getting what I'm saying because it's funny, or are they not getting sympathy? So in the end I said, I better do something. And so I found that as a librarian, better to do it, because I was still working on that as well too.
And it is, I just find it interesting that you've kept coming back to, rather than say a PhD or a professorship or something like that that's very focused, coming back to the tools with which those things are achieved in the first place, and that's been more interesting to you, and also that you've then been able to apply that to a much wider range, much greater audience than if you'd gone down that narrow focused path of PhD and professorship.
Well, one of the things that I found early on is that in librarianship, as I mentioned to you earlier, whoever you come across, there's a way to help you out. I remember at times in the PhD program, it was just this, would love to help you, but I'll have to kill you. And by this time as a librarian, I kind of realized, like, dude, it's an oral reading list. It's not a secret.
It's amazing how much secrecy there is, and all that sort of thing.
And that was the thing too. And I, again, God bless those folks who, have gotten their PhDs and are teaching. I don't want to slam them too much, but at times they focus so much on that little tree as opposed to the whole forest. For me, it's just far more fun to come to work and learn something different, something new. And the advantage, I think, what I bring to the table, if you will, is that I've been there. So whether it's an undergrad or as a grad, I can kind of tell you, well, look, this is what you're after. And all too often, without meaning it, I think, in a PhD program, for certain disciplines, they just leave you out in the dark. You're just kind of guessing it all
some of it's
out.
Very unstructured.
And there is a process. There is a very much, there is a process. And it's also very straightforward. I'm often asked, well, what was the PhD like? It's like nothing more than a time exercise on a particular topic. That's it.
You're right, and that's where having someone like you, on hand is so important, because you help them through. How do you even ask the right questions in the first place? Without that, you're totally lost. You're just kind of writing for 3 to 5 years.
The other thing that also comes into play, and this applies both to my Chicano Latino students, but also older students, regardless of what disciplines I cover. Something that's often referred to as the imposter syndrome, where certain students, returning students, older students, and as I said before, the aforementioned Chicano Latino students, often feel as though they don't belong there. That they pulled a scheme. They find themselves like, well, I'm here now. What do I do? What do I do? And I was like, you know what? It's okay. You do belong here. You have made it through your hard work. And again, I kind of feel as though it's a responsibility in the sense that when I was going through the UC system, there were a number of people who went out of their way to help me, so I kind of feel as though I'm giving back. And it's also, again, it's just, you know, I keep thinking about, I mean, oftentimes just the need to just get people out there, if you will, just to get through the process and not lingering, hang about, or get some kind of guidance, if you will.
Well, and the Chicano Latino studies, that's a perfect example of what you were saying before, how you know, you didn't want to go down a path that was kind of focused and secretive. You wanted to make, you know, this information available to so many people.
Sure, sure. And
that's a perfect example of an area of study that's kind of difficult to access sometimes.
It is, it is. Although having said, difficult to access in the sense that it's not readily available through what you would call traditional sources, print resources. Now, having said that, there's an abundance, though, of materials that you find, you know, where scholars, young and old, for certain disciplines, are taking advantage and, you know, social media. So, for example, as you point, you know, for Chicano studies, if I'm going to find materials, I'll find material that's in print, but you'll find it's dated. It's no longer reflective. So, for example, I'm an example of that, for example, in the sense that, you know, when I mention Chicano studies, even that in its own way is kind of a dated term. I mean, I'm Nicaraguan American. I'm not Chicano, as are the number of people, you know, that you would, you know, identify. I mean, that term, again, if you say Mexican American, what does that really mean? I mean, how are you identifying it? I mean, now you have so many different stripes, if you will, of Latin Americans and even Mexicans, if you will, so that it doesn't apply. But a lot of the stuff that you are finding that does kind of cover this differentiation, if you will, is to be found through social media, be it through blogs, YouTube, you know, again, Twitter. It's just amazing stuff that when you're able to feed into it now. You know, non-traditional sources are often, you know, that's where you begin to find this exciting stuff. I mean, I earlier mentioned Professor, you know, Chavez Garcia. She and her other students, or rather faculty in the Chicano Studies program, and also to be fair, other disciplines, are increasingly putting materials that you find on YouTube. So there's a wealth of information there. Now, having said that, there are other disciplines that I'm responsible for where traditionally it's kind of a mixed, or they still or peer-reviewed journals, or they still rely on traditional print resources, textbooks, and such, and so on and so forth. So, so again, I guess it depends on the discipline, if you will.
Well, and it's a great example again of how, you know, like libraries are facing a challenge where so many resources are going from print to digital. And you know, for the layperson, the immediate reaction is, oh well, then, you know, we won't have libraries anymore soon. But that's not the case.
No. I mean, well, you'll have you're right. A lot of the stuff is going increasingly online, but you made a very good point as well too about the management of this information. I often point out to students that, you know, because I'll have someone say to me, well, that's nice, Roberto, what you're pointing out to me, but I found what I've needed online, and I'll point out to them and say, well, yes, you found, but I hope you know that the vast majority of the information that's out there is through locked databases, something that your fees are helping to pay for. I assure you, the minute you graduate from UC Davis,
that won't be the
that won't be the case. All of a sudden, I mean, there's just so much data that's being generated daily that it gives this impression of, wow, there's so much, but you know, guess what? There's even more that's just been, you know, you can't access because of copyright concerns, or just for the fact that, well, someone owns it and you have to pay into it.
Exactly, and that's where libraries are so valuable. I mean, quite a few of my friends, I'm from a science background, and so many of my friends have said to me exactly that. You know, after we've graduated, I've gone to look up a paper, and I can't get it. Because either I can't find it, or I can't afford it.
And that's something that is, you know, is beginning to change, because I also am of the opinion that, you know, we at times find these absurd situations where we're having to pay for something that we have paid already. I mean, it's something that I think back in the day when you had print journals and print materials,
and they have to cover the costs.
Exactly. And so, for example, I'll find, you know, some materials, for example, found through traditional dissertation databases that, you know, shock of shocks. They won't go out of their way to tell their, you know, undergrad or grad students that some of this material is found open access-wise, freely available. There's one database that comes to mind, for example, that I always kind of laugh at in the sense that it charges students access to Canadian dissertations. Of course, they will mention that many years ago, the Canadian government made a decision to, have any dissertation published
Public.
in an open access manner. So
Yes.
in the United States, we're thinking, oh, I need to pay X amount of monies to get access. I was like, no, actually, if you just go online, it's really
It's
available.
right there.
It's right there. You don't have to pay X amount of money. And again, I'm not. If somebody needs to make money in the capitalist system, that's fine. But
Yeah.
when it comes to the point of sheer exploitation, come on now, that's a little criminal at that point.
Yeah. Where do you see open access going?
I think it's increasing. I think it's increasing. The conversation is moving towards us having to realize that yes, there are important copyright infringement concerns and the management therein, but people are beginning to assert their rights, if you will.
Yeah.
The wonderful thing about social media and its continuing bloom is that people are beginning to realize, wait, why am I having to pay for this information? If you make the connection of, well, I paid taxes, I paid fees, why am I yet having to pay it again? Or on the part of the producers of that information who are simply saying, well, wait, why am I giving my copyright to these folks where I then have to then pay for it? Why can't I simply post this information?
Yeah.
And that's something that 10 years ago, you would have had to learn a coding language, you would have had to found server space.
Yeah.
I mean, this nowadays, one can
drag
simply,
and drop.
drag and drop, that's it, you're good to go, and the point is that we're moving towards more open access, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
I think it's the idea that somehow if it's freely available, that
Diminishes the value
diminishes the value, or that somehow that'll cause print to drop. No, it's the same view that more than 40 years ago there was this view that with computers and the coming of all these things that you would lead to what would have been a paperless society.
Yeah.
Well, the joke is that with this, you often have people printing more than is the case.
Yeah.
So too with open access. Open access merely leads one to simply say, oh, well, now I want to acquire this in a print way. So that, for example, I have 2 Kindles, but it doesn't prevent me from still wanting to buy books. In fact, sales increase.
Yeah.
Print-wise, not decrease. This idea that well, I'm good to go. I have my Kindle, I have my iPhone. It's like, no, you kind of still want to hold on to it physically. So that's. So I'm always kind of weary when I hear this idea that bright, beautiful future with no print inside.
Yeah, people haven't stopped printing. Vinyl is not dead.
No, it's all coming back. It's always been there too.
Yeah. Well, what are your plans for the UCD library then?
Well, that's a very good question. We're still at UCD. We're still in the process of working out our mission, goals, and statements that are going to be working hand in hand whatever direction we're getting from Chancellor Katehi.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is moving towards an increase in what you would call it. Well, one scenario is an increase in electronic resources, and that's often driven just by in some cases just ease of access, ease of format. I mean I don't know the exact. As I said, those are still being worked out, and these often involve negotiations with vendors, not to make it sound as though this is conspiratorial, but we just simply don't know. A lot of the stuff that we're dealing with as we're moving to electronic platforms are handled through something called the California Digital Library. And so, Davis can certainly have leeway, but we need to hear from them and what they work out with these other folks that have the vast majority of this, these databases, if you will.
And it's difficult to coordinate, isn't it? Because it's not just the question of signing up to half a dozen databases and it all gets funneled through thousands.
It's because and that again that reflects the research needs of the populations you're dealing with. I mean, we are moving towards something that you would want to call a 10-in-1, the power of 10 campuses into one, so that say 5 years from now it would be possible. One scenario is for you to go to UCD. And yes, have access to all those databases that the 10 campuses have. Now that's wildly optimistic, but it's not impossible. What needs to be worked out is, well, do you really want to pay for this? I mean, ultimately you need to pay. For example, I mean, great that we have all these very specific databases dealing with, ag and food and such, but is that really going to matter to the folks at UCLA? And vice versa, they have stuff that they're going to ask themselves legitimately, well, why are we having to pay access for these resources if we really don't have those user populations? I mean, it's changing, but at the same time, why? Because then you want to avoid the issue of duplication. Do you really want everyone to be the same? And in some ways, no, you don't. You kind of want your special collections.
And it's interesting, that you brought up, do we want to pay for everyone to, to have the same access? Because that's one of the big challenges with open access as well, and going digital, because it's not necessarily, cheaper to go digital than print.
No, yeah. And as I said, for some, again, it depends on the discipline, depends on the project. I mean, you mentioned the sciences.
Yeah.
They're perfectly geared to do this. The challenge for, the fields that I work with, the humanities and sciences at times, is that, what do you pick? How do you go about it, if you will? I mean, and what exactly constitutes those things that you want to, digitize?
Yeah.
I mean, for some disciplines, I mean, for history, for example, would love to get field notes, would love to get this stuff. But other disciplines are like, well, why?
Yeah.
That doesn't matter to us as much.
Well, so just to kind of wrap up,
Sure.
In one or two sentences, if you could, sort of describe your ideal for, for the library or libraries in general, what would that be?
I guess 3 words: outreach, outreach, outreach.
Okay.
In the sense that I see my goal as wanting to be one of not only service, but to provide that service outside, not just the students that I work with, but the communities that I serve with as well too.
And really connect people to the information.
Because increasingly, we are finding that library users are increasingly more sophisticated than have been the case. This dichotomy of, that's something you would only find at a public library, or versus, that's only something you find in an academic library. No, users of both stripes are now wanting to find those things that there's so much crossover. And I'm not saying that all libraries will be the same, but they're certainly more sophisticated and more varied, if you will, in what it is that they want. So outreach is the only way to make people know aware of that.
Well, fantastic. And on that note, we'll wind up. So, Roberto, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah. And of course, thanks to all of you for watching. Now, if you want to watch the episode again, you can go to davismedia.org, and we'll have a link to the I Love My Librarian award on there as well. Now, while you're at davismedia.org, you can check out past episodes and have a look at the other programs we offer as well. That's all we've got for tonight. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. I'm your host, Patrick Shearer, and you've been watching In the Studio.